Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk about how to color your prints using color theory. This will be important for you to understand in order to create strong colorways. In this first example, we're looking at a student project. Here is her mood board and her color palette. Again, she's using up to 16 colors, which you're allowed to do at this point. And please notice that the colors in her color palette are reflected in the mood board, which is a requirement for this project. Her first colorway, she's working in groupings. So again, this first group is showing great print coordination. Her toss, her plaid, and her half drop all look quite different from each other. And then the color group works together. And again, if we go to the second colorway, it's completely different. So again, they're all coordinating with each other, but they look very different from the first colorway. And they also all relate back to the palette. So this is what you're going to do. The final thing you really need to think about is season. So make sure that all of your colorways work with the season that you're working under. So just to talk about color theory, the reason why it's important is because we can draw the viewer's eye and emphasize different things in a print and actually make the print look completely different. In this example, it's the same design, but recolored very differently so that different parts of the design pop out. Please be aware this is not correct for rotary screen printing because these are not color positions. The color positions aren't preserved. This is just the idea that you could actually get very different looks using different color. So if we're looking at this example, if we just look at this print in grayscale, once we move into color, because the red is a warm color and it's against the rest of the print is cool colors, our eye is immediately drawn to the red, and that creates color movement throughout the print. It's showing us where to look. So our eye goes to the red and we move through the print. A color movement is a very important thing to think about when we are recoloring our prints. In this example, this is a Marimekko print, and they tend to reissue their prints. So what's interesting about this is that this print was reissued and recolored in a completely different season. And we can see here how different the print can look with different colors. One way to think about coloring your prints if you're stuck is to use color schemes. Color schemes are sometimes considered a little bit old-fashioned. They're rules you can totally break, but just to go over it in case you need a place to start when you start recoloring. The 5 basic color schemes are monochromatic, analogous, complementary, split complement, and triadic. I'm going to talk about the first 3 just to talk about the most basic. A monochromatic colorway obviously is working with one single hue and tinting and toning it, getting different values of the hue to recolor. So these are showing the monochromatic palette used in a outfit, but you could do it within a print. The complementary palette is working with colors that are across each other from the color wheel, so orange, blue, red, green, yellow, purple, and usually it creates a very high contrast look. Depending on the amount of color you use of each, you can get something more balanced, or you can get something like the example over here, where the orange is a color pop against the blue. So the less of the color you use, the stronger the color gets, which we'll talk about in another example. Analogous colors usually create a more calm colorway because they're not as high contrast. They're colors next to each other on the color wheel. But depending on how you tint, tone, and shade those colors, you can still get quite a bit of contrast. And right here, this is a very beautiful colorway. Again, here it's not as much contrast. So within the analogous colorway, you can get a lot of variety. One thing we want to think about when we're talking about working with color theory is the idea of contrast, because what color actually is doing is creating contrast, so you're able to see the different motifs. There are, I think, 7 different laws of contrast in color theory, and I'm going to talk about a few of them. Complementary contrast, which we already talked about, but I wanted to discuss even more because it's very powerful. Complements incite each other to maximum vividness when adjacent. meaning this red is going to look brighter against this green ground than a red would look against analogous colors, orange. So the red will always look brighter against a complement. Obviously, again, the complements are across each other on the color wheel. Usually, again, we're getting very high contrast colors, but if you work with colors, especially red and green are considered to be pretty difficult colors to work together. But here are some examples of very sophisticated colorways because these colors, these hues are actually toned and tinted and shaded down in different ways to create really beautiful combinations. So this is an example of a complementary color palette that's quite sophisticated, all three of those. But when we're talking about complements, again, in this example, this is a monochromatic colorway, and everything is even. So your eye is not drawn to any area in this print because everything is mostly red against a white ground. If we look at this recolored print, so it's the same print recolored, now our eye is immediately drawn to the areas of red because the red is complemented by the green. The green is pushing the red forward and making the red brighter. So in this way we can direct the eye and make our prints look very different from each other depending on how they're colored. In this example, you can use complementary colorways across two different colorways. So this print is recolored as a monochromatic red print and then an analogous green-blue print. And again, these are slightly complementary to each other, but what's interesting is that in this cooler print, in the blue, they're still using complements here. This orange is a complement and it's a pop of color, so it actually pops out, gives it a nice contrast, and ties it back to the other print, so they look like they're all from the same collection. When we're working with complements, another type of contrast we want to be aware of is this idea called contrast of extension, which is really about the proportions of color you're using when you're working with complementary colors. The idea here is that some of the proportions actually are more harmonious than others. I'm not going to get into the details, but if you just look at this example at the bottom, when these two colors, the red and green, are used evenly, there really is nowhere for your eye to look. When the red is used sparingly against the green ground, it's much more powerful, and the red provides a pop of color and movement throughout the print. This is shown in this example where we have a print that is, the ground is mostly yellowy orange, and then the purple is used as a pop sparingly. It's not evenly distributed like the yellow and orange. It's less of the purple is used, so it actually becomes stronger. As opposed to this example where, again, a complementary palette with some other colors thrown in, but the yellow and purple are used equally throughout, so it's actually quite calm, and this is a valid colorway as well, but your eye doesn't get drawn to one specific area. So if you really want to create a color pop, think about using the complement actually in a smaller amount, and it will actually pop out more. You also want to think about light and dark contrast, which is pretty obvious, but one thing I'd really encourage you to think about with light and dark is using different ground colors and trying to use a light ground color, a dark ground color, and a medium ground color, and you'll get a lot of different looks within your print. This is an example showing when everything is kind of light, all basically the same weight. This looks more like a texture. When you start to get some dark contrast, the shape pops out in this print. So that's actually quite interesting. Here, again, it's a little bit harder to see the individual shapes. We've got some dark and some light, but they're evenly distributed. So again, they start to draw your eye equally. You'll start to see how interesting this becomes when you start playing around with different colorways. This is a great example of light and dark. This is a student project. Here is her mood board and her beautiful kind of sunsetty color palette. Here's her first colorway, and she is using the highest contrast colors from her palette in this colorway. So she's using the lightest color and the darkest color, and then some neutral colors in between. So this is creating a very high contrast colorway. For her second colorway, she sticks with more colors in the middle of the palette. that aren't as light and dark, so it gets a softer look. So again, we're getting very different looks between the two colorways depending on the light-dark contrast. You also want to think about color temperature. Cooler and warmer colors used together. Usually the warmer colors will come forward and draw your eye in. In this Marimekko print, the ground is the same color, but then the motifs on this side are warmer, so they jump forward. And this is a good example. I always recommend squinting at your colorways because you start to lose the shapes and you literally just see color, and you'll see what pops forward and what's kind of receding, and it'll be helpful to see what where somebody's eye is going to be drawn. In this example, there is the idea of cool, warm contrast between two colorways. So again, here is a warm colorway, and here is a cool colorway. And you can work like this as long as both colorways still fit with the season. So just make sure if you're using blues and it's a spring or summer season that the blues and cooler colors still look like the season. Another really important thing to think about with color theory is color relativity. We see colors in relationship to other colors. So again, you would have done this in color theory, but this pink is the same color, but it appears completely differently against the grounds that you put it by. So depending in your print, if you use this pink, it's going to look lighter or darker depending on the ground it's on. Here's another example of this color relativity idea. Again, so the orange against a similar orange, a brighter orange, it appears darker. Against the complement, it pops out and looks brighter, but they are the same color. This is an example of color relativity. So this print is colored differently. Actually, only the ground has changed. Nothing else in this print has changed. The motifs are all the same color, but they look different depending on the ground. So again, the colors change depending on the ground. When it's against a dark ground, all the lighter colors pop forward. When it's against a light ground, the lighter colors actually are more evenly distributed. If you follow maybe this red flower throughout, you'll see when it's against the complement, it gets really bright. When it's against almost a similar color, it almost basically disappears and recedes. So this idea of really playing around with your colorways to get different looks is really important when you're thinking about color relativity. Again, another thing to think about is color discord and vibrating colors. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Discord can be exciting or eye-catching, but it usually means the colors are competing with each other. They're not in balance. A lot of times it happens when you're working with complements. So this is a great example. Again, Marimekko, working with color vibration and color discord on purpose. This green is really competing and very complementary to the warm colors and even the purple, and you're getting a weird vibrating sensation around the edges, but this is purposefully done. Here again is vibration, where this really tealy blue is vibrating against this bright red background. So if you do this, make sure you're doing it on purpose. A lot of times it's a little harder to look at, but if you want to do it, go for it. Finally, a really important thing is to think about your neutrals, your white, your dark, and your grays, which you really definitely need to have some neutrals in all palettes, no matter how bright the palette. Very rarely do we use achromatic neutrals, meaning white or black. Pure white or black are almost never used in this industry. We usually use a soft black, a charcoal, a blue black, a gray black. White is usually an off-white, a cream, a very pale color. It's not just plain white. That is usually very harsh. The grays are rarely just black and white mixed together. They're usually chromatic, meaning they are colors tinted and toned and desaturated to create the grays. So you'll get really beautiful colors, beautiful grays, if you take your bright color and you desaturate it until it becomes a chromatic gray. And again, this is how you can get some more sophisticated color palettes. A lot of times if you pull an eye drop color directly from an image, you'll get these interesting gray colors. And the grays can either be warm or cool, and you can exploit that using the same concepts of color theory. All right, thanks. Hopefully this was helpful.